No propaganda, no lies, and definitely no BS. You're with Johnny Vedmore on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Johnny Vedmore Show on today's News Talk TNT. I'm here with Rachel Wilson, and we're talking about modern feminism. But I just want to talk about Steinem just a tiny little bit more. In relation to Steinem's effect on modern feminism, I see her as one of the most powerful feminist gatekeepers to emerge since World War II. Why are so many people still completely clueless about what someone like Steinem really represents?
Well, I think because there's a giant media apparatus of propaganda, the likes of which we've never seen, that has promoted her and others as freedom fighters, right? This altruistic cause that they just really care about women and women's rights. So, I mean, Steinem was part of this National Student Association, which was basically an intelligence front and part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA project, part of an even bigger project, which was called Operation Mockingbird. Probably some of your listeners know about that. The Congress for Cultural Freedom had over 400 journalists working for them in the 60s to promote liberalization of the West and liberalized values as part of the Cold War. It was like part of this Cold War initiative. So when you've got like major newspapers, magazines, and TV outlets, especially during this era when the boomer generation is young and there is no alternative media yet, they had almost nothing to combat this giant media apparatus of propaganda, which just beat into their heads that, you know, women were these oppressed victims throughout history and that this was necessary. It was akin to slavery. You always see, even since the Civil War, the feminist movement is always like trying to connect itself to slavery abolition and things like this. So then on top of that, right, you have the Ford Foundation creating the gender studies departments as a discipline, which it had never been before, and that happened in 1970. That's right when they start pushing women into university and saying, you can't be a stay-at-home mom. It's extremely risky. You can't depend on your husband to support the family because you're going to, I mean, they really convinced a generation of women that you'll be abused if you depend on your husband to support you and your children. So you've got to go to college. You have to. That's what the smart girls do. That's what the successful women do. So of course, they see women's studies, and a lot of them want to go into women's studies, which is only going to be run by women who have already bought into feminism. Nobody goes to be a feminist studies professor unless they're already convinced, right, and on board with feminism. So just this huge media brainwashing apparatus. And remember that the CIA at this time is also conducting MKUltra studies, which is another giant operation to figure out how to control public opinion. It's basically mind control, right? So the reason people don't know or don't understand this is, first of all, they don't understand about cultural and social engineering. They don't understand that the CIA is not this like benevolent force just trying to protect the United States from foreign enemies. In fact, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a massive violation of the CIA charter, which says you're not supposed to be doing that sort of thing, like domestic spying and propaganda, but they were. So I think, yeah, so many people are just very unaware of this because of the giant propaganda machine that it created.
It's very interesting because the when you see I think it's in 1967 where Ramparts and other news organizations are revealing how the CIA have been funding all of these different operations, and Steinem first goes on TV, and at the end of that like TV spot where she admits that she was in the pay of the CIA, it's called In the Pay of the CIA, I think. Where at the end of that, she kind of describes the CIA, as the commentator described, as being like a kindly uncle or something along those lines who was just out for your best interest. And that's really what they were trying to. And so the CIA have clearly done a number on feminism. So how hard is it to change the narrative now when it was seemingly set in stone an entire generation ago?
Well, it's really tough. I go on a lot of these like big podcasts where they're talking about dating and relationships between men and women and how awful it is how this younger generation, like Gen Z and even millennials, don't even know how to date, how to relate to each other, how to have relationships anymore. And the girls that I talk to are very brainwashed. They don't know why they believe what it is that they believe about women and men and these sort of things, why they have this strong, independent woman mindset. But if you look at the pop stars, the movie stars, every single major female figure in media these days is hypersexualized, is, pushing the strong, independent, sexually liberated woman narrative, the I don't need a man narrative. And there's a reason for that. I mean, you can't engineer society if you have intact families where men have a vested interest in protecting their wife and their children. And what we've seen is that this was a very effective campaign to kind of remove fathers from the home and replace them with the state. If you look at out-of-wedlock births and you look at welfare spending in the United States and you plot them on a graph from 1960 to now, they go up almost completely in lockstep with one another. So I think that it's just shattered the underpinnings of what holds society together.
It's a base, like the most base form of divide and conquer, isn't it? You divide inside the home, you get between man and woman, and it takes away from romance and all of that, because you can't be soppy about a strong woman. Often you'll get told to man up and stop being the romantic or the person who wants to do good for your wife, or the person who cares about your wife and your family. Is true. It feels like that we've been separated, we've been pulled apart, and everything. Whenever I read literature from the past, I always feel like we're missing something, that something's been taken away, something's purposely been taken away, and I think that's what you described there. Now, you're clearly doing important work, and you're talking about a lot of stuff that a lot of people, including a lot of feminists, are very worried. And I've spoken to a lot of feminists behind the scenes. I know I'm just a man. I'm just a man in the world.
How dare you?
How dare I possibly speak to women to try and understand what's really going on? But I do kind of understand what's happening. And I try and take it from a perspective where I have I give everything a pinch of salt anyway, because people are unique and individual anyway. But you're doing a lot of stuff, and your work, you've got, and it's a highly rated book, Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. It's definitely on my list of must-reads. What made you start writing such a vital work?
Well, it kind of started for me when I was 20 years old and I had my first baby. Everybody around me from the time I was little said, you're going to go to college and you're going to have a career, especially because I was in a lot of gifted programs. And by the time I finished high school, in public school, I realized that school was not about education. It was not for smart people. It was not there to make you smarter. It was largely kind of an indoctrination camp where they condition you to behave in a certain way, which I didn't want to continue doing. So I didn't go to university. I had a full scholarship. I declined it. And I had my first child when I was 20, and everybody thought my life was over. And I remember everyone around me just telling me, you've got to go to work. The baby will get used to being in daycare. You'll get used to being away from her. This is how you have to do things. This is how we do it now. And I kind of looked around myself and I went, this is crazy. I'm going to this job. I'm going to pay half of what I make to some other lady for her to raise my child most of the day, which is what I want to be doing. And even the Christian conservative women around me think this is fine and normal. And I just thought it was incredibly unnatural, very inefficient, and bizarre. So that was kind of when I started thinking about these things. And then over the course of homeschooling my own children, which I ended up having 5, I'm a big history fan, just like you are. And I kind of, these questions are in my head and I start looking into it. I start reading about women's liberation movements and I thought it would be about the funding, the book. I thought it would be about the progressive industrial elites who funded it and pushed it, and the CIA, and it is. There's a lot of that in the book. But there was also this connection I could not ignore to Luciferianism, occult religion, very anti-Christian sentiments all throughout even the earliest feminists, going back to like, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft. And Steinem agrees with this. Steinem said that Christianity was the number one thing standing in the way of women's liberation, and so did Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said this in 1895 when she wrote The Woman's Bible with a couple dozen other feminist radicals of her time. So I couldn't ignore this thread of like anti-Christian sentiment that ran through, and like, you know, people's beliefs are what pushed them to do something like this. So I wanted to understand their worldview, their religious beliefs, their philosophical beliefs, and that's in large part what the book is about as well. It's a worldview kind of spiritual war, essentially.
This is Johnny Vedmore on today's News Talk TNT.